as I said in the previous lecture, the moon is our nearest neighbor, and so it makes sense that this would be one of the first places to send spacecraft, and in fact it was, and but it's still a long ways away from us. Now, getting there is not easy. One of the highlights of the 20th century was a manned mission to the moon, the Apollo program. And the announcement that we're going to be going there with a manned mission goes back to the early 1960s, but it was long before that that people started thinking about going to the moon. And studying the motion of things, Russian Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, a physics instructor, suggested that rockets could be used for space travel. The idea being that a rocket is a device or a machine that spews stuff out the back end of it, and conservation momentum says all the stuff being pushed out that way pushes the rocket forward. Okay, it's a little more complicated than that, but that's in my physics 1 class we actually have a whole lecture on rocket science, and but this was the basic concept right there. Now that was actually before the first the Wright brothers and the first aircraft, and so the idea that we can fly around in space with rockets, and of course that's what you'd need to do to go to the moon. Now the Wright brothers were the first powered aircraft. Gliders had existed prior to that somewhat, and so there's always been this argument as to whether the Wright brothers get credit for being the first aircraft, but still you need air for gliding. American Robert Goddard studied rockets, and he actually built liquid-fueled rockets. Now, up to that point, most rockets were solid fuel. Now, what's solid fuel? Solid fuel is like gunpowder that's kind of fabricated so it burns in a somewhat controlled fashion. Think fireworks. You know, typically it's solid rocket that fuels it until it explodes. And so, and of course, that was one of the problems with solid fuel, is that once you start it, you can't stop it. It burns until it's burned out, so you can't control it, you can't throttle up, you can't throttle down, you can't shut it off, and so you're just along for the ride once you start it. So liquid fuel was considered safer and more controllable. Goddard worked out the details of liquid-fueled rocketry and worked on it. But about the time Goddard was doing his work, in Germany there were several others like Hermann Oberth. Oberth was a rocket scientist in Germany that was studying, how rockets work as well. And then Werner von Braun. Werner von Braun was a rocket scientist in Germany as well. Now, von Braun was started off in school really not doing very well in math and science. He was really much more interested in athletics and things of that sort, German history and whatnot. But he kind of liked science fiction, and he was reading science fiction and reading about rocket ships and so forth, and actually got his brother to strap a whole bunch of fireworks onto the back of a wagon and propel him in a little rocket sled down the street. He got in trouble for that. But in one of his science fiction magazines that he was reading, there was an advertisement for Oberth's book about rocketry, and he said, well, if I want to learn about rockets, I got to read this. So he bought the book and opened it up and realized it was all math and physics, and he said, oh no, because math and physics were his two worst subjects. So he decided he was going to have to buckle down and study math and physics. He ended up going from those being the two worst subjects to being his best subjects, graduating with honors in math and physics, going to university, getting degrees in physics, graduate degree in physics, PhD, studying rockets. And so he became a full-on rocket scientist. Now, the problem is that here he is building this rocket group in Germany in the 1930s. This is during the Great Depression. Nobody wanted to fund science, particularly in Germany, which was as bad off as the United States for the Great Depression, maybe even worse. The only people that had any money was the Army. And so the Army was actually limited by the treaty at the end of World War I, so they could not build really big artillery pieces. But the treaty said nothing about rockets. And so von Braun convinced the Army that he could build rockets for them that could send a warhead as big or bigger than their biggest artillery piece. And so they funded his research. He really wanted to build spacecraft, and that was his real passion here, was to build spacecraft. And he kept thinking, well, maybe one day we can actually get the money to build a space vessel. So, but in the meantime, he did get money to build bigger and bigger rockets for the Army. Well, then World War II started. And so the Army had him building these very large rockets called V-2 rockets. That's not really what he called them, but that was what they would call in the U.S. were V-2 rockets. And these were these giant rockets, giant for those days, that would launch in Germany and bring extremely large warheads that would drop on England. And so he built these rockets, and he was working on an even bigger rocket that would actually reach the United States. He actually got in trouble once because he was at a bar having a drink and a local tavern, and he was talking to this girl that he met there and telling her that he really thought that Adolf Hitler was ruining the country, and turned out she was a Gestapo agent. So he ended up in prison for about a week or so until the head of the Army bailed him out and actually had to go to Hitler himself and say, look, we need the guy to build these rockets. And so got released. And then towards the end of World War II, he and the other rocket scientists defected to the United States. And so they defected to the U.S., and so we brought them actually to Texas. And so out near El Paso, Army base out there, and they started working on a rocket group. So we got the rocket scientists. The Soviet Union actually got some of the leftover rockets and the construction facilities, and so they started backwards engineering that. We put him to work actually building rockets for our military, because we wanted rockets too. And so he wanted to build more spacecraft, but instead we put him to work building rockets. In fact, we made him director of the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, which was then headquartered in Alabama, in Huntsville, Alabama. He actually traveled the United States all over the place, being a champion for rockets and space exploration, encouraging rocket clubs and school groups and so forth. He had fan clubs. People would write letters to him, and he'd send autographs back. And so he really wanted to have a United States space exploration program, but we really wanted him to build more rockets. So he built a souped-up version of the V-2 rocket called Redstone, which was a missile that was intermediate range ballistic missile. And they built these much larger ballistic missiles called Jupiter missiles. And so we had him building missiles for us, even though he really, really wanted to build spacecraft. And so, and he becomes a big part of the story of how we got to the moon.